Hello, Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Lawrence. This is Reverend Aaron. We're piloting doing program on our YouTube channel. So this is an experiment. We don't know how things are going to work, but we hope to bring some parts of our community to you during this unprecedented time in our society. I will light the chalice, the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist faith. Feel free, if at home you have a candle or a chalice, to light that as we say the words that we use every time we light our chalice together. We light this chalice for love, hope, and peace. So now I'll turn it over to Graham Kriker for a couple of announcements. Again, we're experimenting with this, so if you have suggestions about how we could do things better, please do let us know.
Thank you, Reverend Aaron. There's not a whole lot of good news this week, but one small bit is you don't have to fill out a teal card today. We're delighted to have an excellent speaker who's been with us several times before, but I want to just ask all of you, before we introduce him, to keep the money we're going to put in the collection plate this Sunday, and we will be sending you an email advising you how we're going to proceed with our Agency of the Month in a way that will be fair to all, especially to the NAACP, which is this month's recipient of our collections. Our speaker this morning was born and raised down in the Osage Territory in Oklahoma. He's a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, and in California at San Francisco, gained a couple of advanced degrees. He's best known in this part of the world as the man who for about 22 years led the Ecumenical Christian Ministries, and one of his great achievements was getting us to join, which has been a benefit to us and we hope to them. Thad is a marvelous speaker with a great history, and if you were here right now, I'd ask you all for a big round of applause to welcome Reverend Thad Holcombe.
Thank you, Graham and Aaron, both of you, for inviting me. This is a real honor. It's not a dubious one. It's an experiment that I think will be worthy of trying. I do appreciate the introduction. Probably if somebody heard me, they would grimace a bit, Graham, because I went to Oklahoma State University, not OU. But that's okay. In Oklahoma, there's more competition than up here as far as concerned. I'm fortunate to have a way to kind of arrange this that goes back. And, you know, when you're my age, almost 80, there's a lot to say. Some of it's superfluous, but something I think is important to remember. There are certain points in our lives that influence who we are today. So I was frankly very fortunate when I went to my first call at the University of Tulsa, an ecumenical position. I applied and received a scholarship to go and get trained with the author of What Color's Your Parachute, which is an alternative way for vocation, which has always been, I think, an important thing for the church and particularly ministry to higher education to be involved in. So I went for 10 days. And part of that was to go back over your life as far as you remember from birth to where you are at that time and find out the significant events in your life and people that influenced you then. And then to make a graph of that in terms of highs and lows. So I did that, and so I can, in a way, have that as a guideline. And I want to spend time on some of those, although unfortunately I'll have to neglect some other very important ones. I do want to say, I think that place for me and for many people is so crucial. My place was a cattle ranch that my father had begun by dropping out of college at Oklahoma A&M at that time in the beginning, and he traversed cattle over 2 days to go to this first place in Osage County, which by the way is just south of Sedan, Kansas, across the border. In the Cross Timbers areas, which Cross Timbers is that area that goes into the tall grass prairie. It is tall grass itself, but it's rolling hills and much timber. That's important because my family there, where I was raised, that place influenced me so much as I look back at it. It was a place where I began to wander outdoors a great deal with my mother and father, and I had a brother that was 4 years older than me, but much of my time was spent alone. Spent alone out in the area of the cross timbers, and in doing so, I don't think there's any question that influenced me greatly. Went to a county school, country school rather, for 4 years, and it was 3 grades in one room, and I still remember as a country boy, at recess we played coyote and dogs. Sometimes you were a coyote, sometimes you were a dog. You would race around the building. And those are the kinds of things that were country. Then I was schooled into 25 on a bus, went to school in Pawhuska, the county seat, 25 miles away, and went through high school. Now, high school for anybody is incredibly important. It was for me. It's a time when you start waking up to all kinds of things, who you are, what you might be, where you are in relationship to others. Well, for me, I had one particular experience which I've shared with many of you before when I was here, spoke with you, I think maybe a month ago. I think it's a profound influence that has, as I look back now, has much to do with who I am today in terms of a person and in terms of how I see being a person of religion and of faith. I always was interested again outdoors. I loved being out there. I also worked with people. My dad had people there, so I learned how to work with people I guess you'd call blue collar or whatever now, and a great relationship with them. I learned a lot from them, but I also spent time in the evenings after work, in the summer particularly, and I would go fishing, and I would sit by the edge of the ponds that we had, and sometimes I would find myself kind of in an immersion with that. Well, there was a fall when I was, I guess, my junior, senior in high school. I went out, as I always did, and to observe the bird life, because I was seriously thinking at that time of going to the university, to Oklahoma State, and becoming an ornithologist. So I went up to this pond dam, and I crept up over it and had my binoculars, and I looked down at the other end, and not much. There were, I think, 2 or 3 mallards or something, and maybe my gander or 2. And I moved, though, the binoculars over to my left, and all of a sudden I just saw an explosion. The water and the bushes over there were moving back and forth. And I looked at it, it was enlarged, and emerged out of that was a bobcat. And that bobcat had a duck. And the duck was hanging from the mouth of that bobcat, and blood was dripping. And it moved up to the brow of that hill and turned and sat down, and through the binoculars it was looking at me. I was so moved by that, and I'm sure this didn't take maybe even more than, what, I don't know, 20 seconds. And then it seemed to just disappear magically. Of course, what it did, it was blended into that fall weather and back into the bush. And I left there profoundly moved. At that time, I was going into a small county church, in First Presbyterian Church in Pawhuska. We always laugh, there never was going to be a second, but it was First Presbyterian. And there was a youth group there. And fortunately, there was a pastor who was very intent on how the biblical tradition were stories. Well, somehow or another, I connected all of this into stories, and I saw in that, and this is looking back, of course, when you make sense out of your life, that duck in that incident was a story of suffering that I identified with and realized my suffering is not just mine, but it's a larger sense of the world and the web of life that we live in. So that moved me as I went to Oklahoma State University and did enroll in wildlife management, and I stayed there for, I guess almost 2 semesters, and then I finally decided I needed to find some way, because it was beginning to eat at me a little bit. I may want to go into ministry. This would be helpful, but I decided that I would get a major that had the most electives, which was in Oklahoma State was philosophy. Now, granted, Oklahoma State is not known as a great philosophical school, but it had the most electives. So I did that, and in the process, I also, in my sophomore year, was walking down the street, and this was, of course, after, which being a good Southern man, and Oklahoma's enough Southern, I had, of course, pledged a fraternity, gone to the rites and become a member. At the same time, I was uneasy about that, but, you know, I was thinking about it, and I remember being downtown and then coming back to campus and walking by this old shotgun house. And on it, it said UCCF, United Campus Christian Fellowship. So I went inside, and there were two pastors there, and talked with them, and they invited me to come back, and I did. Well, the consequences of that, there was at that time a series called Academy Series that they were having, which was bringing together in a covenant relationship. You agreed, in which they asked me to be a part of, which I did, to meet once a week over dinner and read these outstanding theologians, and then agree to go to some kind of worship service somewhere once a week. And also there was a certain way that you read this material. If some of you out there remember the Ecumenical Institute, you know how that was done, but there's a certain way everybody had to read and understand, agree what the author said, and then you were invited to say, where were you with this author? Well, I had never before known that there was such an intellectual history within the Christian faith. I had no idea there was a Paul Tillich or a Barth or a Niebuhr or all these things. Unfortunately, they were all male at that time, as I remember. But still, it was a transforming experience for me. At the end of that year, the other thing that happened is that I was selected after Green. I was scared to death, actually, but Pastor asked me, campus ministry, if I'd like to go in a junior year abroad. And I was kind of, well, that's okay. I went home, and again, my parents, they got so excited. Neither one of them had finished college, but they, again, thought this was a real opportunity. Well, go, do it. So, okay, so I decided to go to India, where at least the language was English. I didn't have any others. I've unfortunately neglected even to take Spanish in high school. Well, I ended up in India. But in the process of doing that, I also traveled through the Middle East. And when I went on this trip, they asked me, they said, Dad, do you want to take a workshop, a 10-day workshop on Zionism? I had no idea what Zionism was. You know, in a way, I think I was a hayseed Okie. And so I looked it up, and then I said, well, that looks kind of interesting. And so I went and did that. I just want to say at the end of that, finding that there were so many forms of Zionism, we traveled to a refugee camp. I had never seen, again, so much suffering, the smell, the stink, the poverty, anger. It still was just seared into me. And so I left there going into India, and I didn't need any more orientation to the poverty of India by that time. And of course, India was very influential upon me because I was one of 2 American students at a university. We lived in separate hostels or dormitories. So I came out of that and came back, which was important when I came back, because the culture shock in coming back 1 year later, besides the point, I had learned to speak English with an Indian accent. I still remember talking to my father on the phone in New York, and I told him I'd never heard such a hick in my life. It was that Oklahoma accent came back. Of course, I was speaking it within a week, but still. But then I went to, came home, and that was when the transformation somewhere along the line is, I remember still, we were herding cattle into pens. I was back working there late summer. And my dad, the 3 of us learning about Dad, said, be sure to get those on in there, you know. And I said something like, I can handle this. Well, all I remember is my dad got off his horse, he went to the house. I went inside the house after I'd helped get the cattle in. My mother said, I think maybe you want to speak with your dad. So I went back. That was the first time I ever saw my father cry. You know, it wasn't just that he was hurt by that. He realized, and he said to me, you know, my dad wanted me to be an attorney, and I decided to go and be in the ranching. And I know you're thinking about doing something different than coming along in this ranch, and that's good. So there was a breakthrough for us to where there was a whole new relationship that was established in that kind of time. And then I go back to the university, and I have the other thing that happens to me with culture shock in a reverse way. Here I was in the fraternity again, and I went back and they were talking about the same damn things they talked about before. Who was going to date what and what was happening. And finally, a friend of mine, there was about 4 or 5 of them, said, "Dad, you know what you're doing?" I said, "No." He said, "You're just walking away from these conversations." I was so self-righteous. And part of it was I had these big questions in my mind, is that why aren't they talking about the poverty, about the experience of our capitalist society? Because I'd had an advisor in India who was a member of the Communist Party. Well, in 1961, you don't even say communism without a grimace. And then I found out that was the most honest political party in India. So I had my whole world turned upside down. And here I came back and nobody was talking about these things. Well, that was my experience. That wasn't theirs. So I learned something from that. I can share mine, but I can't expect to impose my experience upon others. Well, I finished up at the university in philosophy and took a little bit of graduate work, and then was married, went to the seminary, which I had, by the way, I think I always laugh at myself. I selected this seminary because I definitely wanted to be on the East Coast or West Coast. That was my preference, and maybe Chicago, but finally I was looking at a newspaper and a sidebar said, "Seminary professors states that it's not necessary to affirm the virgin birth." I said, well, I guess that's where I'll go. No profound. And it happened to be a Presbyterian seminary that was very ecumenical, the San Francisco Theological Seminary. So I went, we both went, and it was one of those incredible times, because that was the 60s, assassinations, all those things were going on. We had Selma. People went to Selma out of the seminary, and I wasn't able to go, I was working, but what I did do is that I agreed to go on a march in Marin County, which is one of the most affluent counties in the United States. And we would just march, and we had signs down supporting Selma. Still, when I finished up seminary, I decided to stay a little longer because I wanted to do some work, as the person had asked me why I wanted to go into clinical training as well as theology, and I said, well, I've spent 3 years now looking at the outside and social ethics and Bible, and I think I want to look at my navel. And he said, well, that's maybe a good idea. Not only did I look at my navel, but I also learned how groups become communities and how it's best to listen and what to listen for, and also share and be vulnerable and take those kinds of risks. So I finished up there, and I knew that I wanted to go and be in a ministry with higher education. And regardless of some folks that tried to dissuade me of that, because I would have gone to a congregation. I was looking, matter of fact, this place in Kansas City, I got a phone call, and I ended up in experimental ministry at the University of Tulsa. It was campus and community, with the inner city and with the University of Tulsa. Well, the long and short of that is that I ended up doing community organizing. I became a community organizer as well as a campus ministry with the faculty and staff and student at the University of Tulsa, at Auburn University, private school. And so in community organizing, I learned my first lesson. In community organizing, it's best to find out who are the friends and who is it that agrees with your objectives, but most of all, find out what are those objectives. What is it that people are disgruntled about? Because I had helped in a meeting over about 4 months with the area ministers, 6 different congregations in areas. I gathered them together. And then I got the Central Tract, and we looked at it, and I said, we're living at the University of Tulsa in an emerging inner city neighborhood. Now you got to remember that Oklahoma is in a much different place than Kansas, historically. Tulsa is a relatively young city. State established 1907, all those things. So we began going around and contacting people, and we said we're going to have a meeting to for an organization for the community, and called the president of the university, and he said, well, that's nice. He said, I hope you have a good time. And I said, well, some of the concerns may be the university. He just kind of, frankly, was a little patronizing. I said, thank you. We want to be sure we let you know. We had a meeting. We set up 40 chairs. We had 140 that showed up. You know what they were angry about? They knew that the University of Tulsa was going to take over their homes. They knew that urban renewal was going to destroy their lives. Headlines, next day in the Tulsa World. The University of Tulsa threatens neighborhood. So then I receive a call from the president. He said, is there any way we can be a part of this? I said, yes, and so they became part of it. No. If you try to open up the possibilities for a conversation, and if they don't work, well then, maybe the other tactics are necessary. That is, maybe you need to have a public presence there and even embarrass people if necessary. But if that isn't taken first, you may burn too many bridges. Well, that's something I've carried into my life. And as I went in to continue with ministry with higher education, I came more and more convinced as students got involved and faculty got involved in the community, what it was like to have a praxis theology. And that is how to engage yourself in something and come out of that and have a community to where you can share your experiences and allow for the differences. And you also can, at the same time, let those differences be appreciated to the extent that you can laugh or cry or whatever about it. But you know, that's, to me, is what faith community is about, is building communities where that can happen. Often it's not in our society, very often because of our individualism that's so prevalent. Well, in doing so, I think what happens is, instead of becoming homogeneous kind of what people think happens in community, if you have real community, you discover your uniqueness. And it's also true because I'd already done some, and some of you that are listening to and seeing this probably know that there's a whole study called faith development. And that people reach a stage in faith development, and sometimes they're stuck. They're stuck where they like kind of an advanced adolescence and whatever. They like community. They like being with people, but don't dare raise questions. If you do, then you basically are out. But if you have another one which goes a little bit further, which a community supports you being engaged, so you can come back and you can learn and you can laugh and you can cry and you be vulnerable, then that faith community, all the people there benefit from it. So the laughing and crying is what I tried to facilitate as I continued in ministry, and which I think was important not only for me, but for others. My crying happened as certainly in the depths of, I could chart out of my life, the highs and the lows, was a divorce. It was devastating. The failure that both of us felt. And yet, we learned from it, I must say. And after divorce, kind of climbing back up and then getting involved in life again, those 3 years were a learning experience. And then getting remarried, and a wonderful Linda I'm married to now, and then having 2 children. But the harrowing time I had is when our oldest, Nana, got meningitis. Fortunately, my wife had caught it during the day and was called in and did a spinal tap, and we went in. And that was my first time that I was on the receiving end of a pastoral call. And that pastoral call was the minister came in, and he didn't say to me, and he could have, he didn't say to me, we'll pray, if you would like to pray. He just sat down with me and we watched these machines. And then we talked and then he left. It was profound to me. So I just remembered the presence with people who are in crisis is so important. They are to me, and I think that's true for others. And then we adopted international adoption. Kara was from South Korea. And we didn't learn until she was probably 6 or 7 or 8 years old how bullied she was. She went to Hillcrest. We thought that was a good deal because internationals, and she was truly bullied. And we didn't learn that till later because she was different. So that was painful, but yet we learned from it that we need to be open to what might be the possibilities that come up for people. Then I go back and I remembered all, by this time I had brought to, hopefully, to Kansas when I came in 91, because by that time I'd gone from the University of Tulsa and then I'd gone down to the rival school, Oklahoma University. And as we say there, I was an Aggie that stayed in the closet for 8 years. But I learned a lot. It was a great place. Different, totally different than OSU, as it's different from KU. But then the opportunity came up at KU, and so I came in 91. And it had been a wonderful experience. Again, an experience of ecumenicity, which all of mine have always been. And of course, some of you know it was later in that thing, I think halfway through my tenure there, that the Unitarians made inquiry about becoming a part of who we were at that time. And they were rightly a little suspicious, you know, because here was primarily a Christian group. And so we assured them, because we also had the same questions raised by the Quakers who joined us. We're not about out to recruit people to be Christian. We are open, though, to having people come in and explore who they are as people of faith. And if they want to be Christian, fine. But it's more important, as St. Francis somehow said, maybe it's better if we just do what we do and not have to talk about it so much. And if you don't, fine, maybe there's some other one that you want to be. And sure enough, you know, we had people that came that were lapsed Catholic, and we had people that became Buddhist, and we had people with Muslim tradition and Jewish, and we all learned from them. And so the ability to be accepted and to kind of ask as you're engaged and experienced, because we also emphasize the importance to have experiences. That's why we did so many alternative breaks. And people came back from 1 week. It's almost my being in India for 1 year. They came back profoundly changed. They'd never been in that race. They'd never been in the rural area of New Mexico or Arizona or the area of Chicago. And we also had an amazing number, and I must say, and it's not just because I'm speaking to you, but we had an amazing number of Unitarian students for about 4 years, I believe, and one of them went on to be on the national staff. Wonderful, and were very instrumental in having that community occur. So this is really a short, I guess you might say, essay. It not even mentioning other instances which I think have been learning for me. I want to mention 2 others. My dad's suicide is, I still am not baffled by, but painful. The murder of students in Nicaragua when I was at KU, an incredible student that was murdered. The suicide of a student when I was OU of physics, and I was the first one to come to his house and to see him hanging. You know, that puts all that Bobcat experience, in a way, the suffering of who we all live with. It's also seen in the window of somehow the kind of gratitude that we have for life and for ministry. And for me, I continue to find that in terms of my engagement and trying to find ways that we can address the crisis that we're in with the environment. So thank you for this opportunity.